Welcome to my channel, where I dive into the darkest horror narratives. Got a chilling story, real or imagined, that you want me to narrate? Drop it in the comments below. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales. Now close your eyes and let the terror begin. Story 1. Ignore the earwig. In many communities, urban legends are a rite of passage. Most of us have grown up with some form of tall tale. Whether it was something as ridiculous as growing watermelon in your stomach because you ate its seeds, or downright terrifying like being taken by a demonic woman because you said her name 3 times in a mirror. Though they may not have much in common on the surface, their significance goes beyond the tales themselves. Urban legends provide children with their first real test of critical thinking. Even if every kid in your class is adamant that some miraculous claim is valid, you're never too sure. In your own growing curiosity, you ask questions, do research, and piece together information from your own understanding of the world. To us adults, it may seem insignificant to determine that a watermelon actually won't grow in your stomach, or that Slender Man didn't actually steal the kid who's been out sick. But in reality, it's the process of logical thinking and finding the truth with verifiable evidence that becomes so valuable later on in life. And it's for these exact reasons that the tale of the earwig strikes a deep-seated dread into every person living in my town. The earwig is a creature born of collective fear, as the story goes. A human-sized bug that waits in the darkness, fixing its body into the tiniest corner so that it can observe you from afar. Long antennae sense the slightest movement. Quick legs and a flexible body allow it to squeeze into every nook and cranny to evade your eye. Unsure of your surroundings, you search, but to no avail. Only when you think you've checked every corner possible do you reluctantly accept that you're alone. Little do you know that the moment you've let your guard down is the moment it glides silently towards you to inject a paralyzing neurotoxin into your neck. The debilitating pain is unbearable, and you thrash around in a desperate attempt to fight back. But a tough exoskeleton protects it from anything you could hope would hurt it. As your body begins to tire, and as your muscles start to seize, fleshy tentacles emerge from an undulating thorax and shoot a sticky material to hold you in place. At the same time, a flexible proboscis pierces your abdomen. It excretes a substance to turn your insides into a soup and happily slurps it up. Once it's had its fill, a second appendage quickly injects thousands of maggots into what will now serve as a petrified cocoon. Horrifying behavior aside, the story for the earwig isn't simply one of a formidable predator. It's one of a creature who, by some unknown means, has conquered the very concept of uncertainty itself. What happens when a being finds a way to always potentially exist? Not just when you finally decide to open your eyes and turn around, but under your bed, in your closet, in every dark place you never thought to check, until you know for a fact that something is or isn't there. The answer to what fills that space is unknown. And in that uncertainty, the earwig finds a home. The more people think about the possibility of its existence, the more it has a chance to find its way into our reality. At first, the kids couldn't possibly understand the ramifications of the tale. For them, it was just a stupid thing they'd say to scare each other. "Don't think about the earwig, or it'll already be too late," they'd say. When one was mad at a classmate or a teacher, they'd shout the name 3 times or draw them a picture of it to make sure that the target of their ire kept the beast in mind. Others would play the long game, finding a victim and making mention of the earwig to them every single day. For most, it was supposed to be harmless kid fun, a dumb myth like any other. As they grew older, they'd forget and laugh when their friends brought it up as adults. But one day, the laughs stopped when a girl was found dead in her room. Her body had seemingly petrified overnight, and what looked like maggots were crawling in and out of her nose. Nobody could figure out what had led to her death. Had she simply stopped breathing? An abnormal medical condition, perhaps? There were no signs of foul play, just a few marks that looked like she had been stuck by a hypodermic needle. But there was no break-in, and the parents surely didn't harm her. So what had led to that tragedy? Sad and confused, the town's children did their best to cope with the event. At first, there was genuine mourning for the young girl, but in a short amount of time, they attached her death to the only thing that made sense in their underdeveloped minds. Soon the earwig had become synonymous with taking the young girl's life. In the minds of the children, she was its first official kill, almost as if the universe wanted to confirm their suspicions. Soon after, another person was found dead. This time a grown man, a teacher who, in all fairness, was hated by much of his class. Like the girl, his body was found petrified with maggots crawling out of every orifice. Needle marks were found on his neck, and some unidentifiable mucus-like substance stuck him to his bed. But unlike the girl, he had a more direct connection to the creature. Drawings of what appeared to be an imposing bug filled his mailbox. Papers he was grading had earwig written all over it with more crude pictures of a similar-looking beast drawn on the back. While the local police couldn't take this as any more than coincidence, and while none of the kids involved faced punishment, it certainly raised the eyebrows of the townsfolk. All the while, word of the earwig was going from urban legend to something that people truly began to fear. As time went on, more deaths came in the exact same manner. Never an overwhelming amount, but a concerning number nonetheless. While some seemed completely unrelated to the creature, most undeniably had some sort of connection to it. It ultimately reached the point where even the most hardcore skeptics wouldn't dare say its name, for fear of bringing a plague upon someone else's home, or worse, their own. A young boy played out in his front yard on a sunny Sunday afternoon. Two neighborhood kids the same age were walking by and stopped to talk with him for a second. A quick exchange of pocket cash was made. The young boy disappeared into his house and then soon re-emerged with a piece of chalk. He casually walked over to the sidewalk and began to draw something as the two boys stood over him and giggled. He didn't even finish half the word before his father came rushing out of the house like it was on fire. The man scooped his son up with one arm while punt-kicking the fallen piece of chalk across the street. Mr. Ned, as the kids called him, was one of the calmest individuals in town. A delightfully happy religious man who never raised his voice even was now beet red. He screamed at the two neighborhood boys to get the hell away from his house before turning his attention to his son and yelled, "You will never fucking do that again. Do you understand me?" He had been shouting with so much force that others couldn't help but peek out their windows to see what the commotion was. One woman even stepped outside to inquire about what was going on. Mr. Ned met her confused gaze with a snarl. With nearly the same level of force he had spoken to his son with, he screamed at her to go inside before marching back into his home with a vice grip on his son's arm. From that day forward, the young boy wasn't allowed out of his house for anything except school until he was ready to leave for college. Supposedly, the two boys who had thought it would be funny to pay the kid to draw the creature's name in public met an even harsher punishment at home. Quickly, word of the earwig wasn't that of legend to the townspeople. They were fact. Just as the sun rose in the sky, so too did the earwig descend in the dark. For them, talk of anything even resembling the creature was taboo, and any slip-ups were met with zero tolerance and swift retribution. There were even instances of police coming to arrest people they heard were spreading the creature's name. False charges were quickly applied, and people were more than willing to lie in court to shut someone up for good. Though it may seem like a mighty overreaction from the outside, it's important to remember what fear does to people, especially when that fear had been justified by years of evidence. When your life and the lives of your loved ones are put in danger because of mere thoughts, it would seem appropriate that people go to extreme measures to prevent those thoughts from ever forming. And when the earwig was off of the minds of the people, life was good. The hope was that, like all things not acknowledged, the legend would fade into irrelevance. and eventually non-existence. But scattered whispers and an irrefutable feeling of constantly walking on eggshells kept the thoughts alive. And by extension, the earwig still ate. Even now and again, another death would surface. The townsfolk would play it off as natural causes or a particularly gruesome homicide. But deep down, they knew the truth. As a kid, my friends and I were bolder with the legend, though we didn't dare speak of the earwig to the degree previous generations had. We played with the concept enough that we put ourselves in real danger of retaliation. Strange as it was, it felt like we were carrying on a tradition. For us, the idea of playing with something so sinister felt fun. In our minds, we were invincible. It felt like we could touch the edge of death, but our youth and hubris would always pull us back onto safe ground. As we got older, the frequency of the story faded until, eventually, we had gone years without speaking of it. I was 17, and in my last year of high school when it ultimately came up again. My friends and I were hanging out before school when we were approached by a kid named Dean Mendez. Dean always had a passion for the macabre and would tell anyone who'd listen about the creepy things he found on the internet. Usually, he'd be excited to tell people about the various things he'd find, but that day he seemed spooked. His eyes were puffy and red, and his hair was a tangled mess. I saw him walking towards us, and as he got close, I went to say hello, but he approached me first. "I need to speak with you. Alone," Dean said, placing his hand on my shoulder a little too tightly. My immediate impulse was to tell him to let go and take a few steps back as I was hit with an odor that no doubt resulted from skipping the shower for the past few days. But despite my initial reservations, I also got the strong sense that Dean needed help. Whatever led him to this condition was obviously pretty severe, and if he needed to talk to me about something that would help him, then so be it. I checked the time and saw I still had quite a bit before my first period class, so I told my friends I'd catch up with them later and walked off with Dean. As we walked, I tried to ask him what was up, but he insisted that we get away from where other people could hear because he was scared they'd judge him. At this point, I'm a little concerned about my own safety. Still, I felt comfortable escaping a confrontation by evaluating the difference in our size and playing with the Swiss Army knife I keep in my front pocket for self-defense. Once he felt we were far enough from prying ears, he stopped and started to cry. "I messed up really bad, man. I messed up really, really bad," he said with his face buried in his hands. I tried to tell him that whatever it was, he'd be okay, and that I was here for him regardless. "You don't understand," he told me. "I went too far. I went way too far." It took a minute before I could get him to calm down, and only when he stopped crying could I get him to actually explain himself. "What happened?" I asked. There was a pause. Dean looked around a moment before taking a step towards me and wrapping his hands around my shoulders again. "I summoned the goddamn earwig," he stated. "I was so curious about the legends, if they were true. For the past month, I committed myself to making sure that it was real. I had to see it. I needed proof. That's what curious people do, right? They investigate things, see if they can find the craziness in our world, and I freaking found it. But I didn't know it'd be like this." For a moment, I was confused, but then my mind suddenly flashed back to all the childhood stories and made connections between the strange deaths and weird behavior around the name. But as far as I remembered, the earwig always killed its victims, left them nothing but a corpse filled with its children. And yet Dean looked perfectly healthy. I asked him how it was possible. If he had indeed summoned the earwig, then how was he still alive? And why was he talking to me about it? He shrugged. All Dean knew was that it wanted him to speak to a few of the people he knew in exchange for his life, remind them that it was still here. It gave him a list of people, and he'd been struggling with what it would mean to follow its instructions since that day. But ultimately, Dean had to choose life. I wanted to be angry for what he'd done to me, I wanted to scream and tell him to get far away and never look in my direction again. But I knew it wouldn't help. I could see the fear in his eyes, and his physical condition showed a kid who clearly didn't want to be doing what he was doing. But he had no choice. For half the day, I existed in a strange stupor. All I could think about was how I'd get myself out. It wasn't until a conversation I had with my friends about how they were stressing about school did I realize I couldn't contribute to the intrusive thoughts. I needed to take my mind elsewhere. It was hell to try. I did everything possible to distract myself over the coming days. But no matter what I did, the intrusive thoughts found their way in. Drugs, music, conversations, picking up new interests, laser focusing on my other stressors. Nothing mattered. Even my then girlfriend got annoyed by how much I wanted to hear about what was on her mind, instead of speaking on my own thoughts. The worst part was that I couldn't reach out to others to explain and call for help without dragging them in. Every day felt like a challenge to keep my mind preoccupied, and I dreaded the moment night hit. Taking sleeping pills early in the evening became routine, as I couldn't risk being alone with my thoughts in the dark for any period of time. To my horror, my parents had told me they were going on a surprise honeymoon vacation and would be gone for the weekend. When I explained how much I didn't want them to leave, they were shocked. A teenage boy gets the house all to himself for a weekend, and he's not stoked. Unfathomable. Finally, it was just me and the dark. It all came to a head the same Friday when I couldn't get to sleep. The sleeping pills weren't working like I had hoped, and I was tossing and turning with the same questions replaying in my mind. Why him? Why me? What does it want? The questions swirled in my brain. I couldn't help but visualize the thing perched on my ceiling, watching me as I struggled. Every sound in the dark was magnified. Was it coming from me? Was it something else? Was it real at all? A tingling sensation shot down my spine, and I shot up in a cold sweat, staring into the void before me, waiting for the creature to lunge forward in the dark. Minutes passed as I sat there, paralyzed in fear. The darkness in my room perfectly reflected the uncertainty of my mind. It felt as though I could put my hand out, and the odds of feeling something were equal to the odds of feeling nothing. I couldn't take it. I sprang up from my bed and made a mad dash for light, flicking it on and seeing nothing, just my room as I had left it. I breathed a massive sigh of relief and went to sit on my bed, content to stay up all night until the sun came up. I reached for my phone, and the screen read 1 a.m. I'd have to stay up quite a while, but it was worth it. I figured I'd need some coffee and slowly began to make my way to the kitchen. Walking down the hall, I turned on the light to the living room, and sitting on the wall between it and the kitchen was a massive black bug. My body felt like it was made of stone. I dared not move as its long antenna searched the air, sensing for the slightest vibrations. I tried thinking of an exit plan, but there weren't any good options. The two I immediately settled on were running back to my room or making a dash for the front door. I figured that at least with the second option, I wouldn't be trapped with the thing bearing down on me. A single turn of my foot sent its antenna into a frenzy. In the blink of an eye, the thing was skittering down the wall and across the floor towards me. I moved towards the front door, hoping I could reach it in time, but it cut me off and shot a sticky substance at my feet. I jumped back just as it hit the ground and turned on a dime towards my room, but only got a couple feet before I could feel something solid on my back. I was yanked backward, and from the moment I hit the ground, it became impossible to stand back up. Just like that, I was caught. The earwig slowly approached me, crawling over me as if it were pacing, trying to decide what to do. Eventually, it settled on standing in front of me, clasping its mandibles together in front of my face. An eel-like tongue slithered out and licked me, but then it gave me some space. Instead of doing what it had done to so many others, it reared up onto its rear legs and revealed a hole with what looked like teeth surrounding it. A mucus-covered, lumpy mass emerged slowly from the hole until it stuck out a few inches. From that mass, two small slits peeled away to reveal milky white eyes. Even though the eyes looked blind, they searched around the room before finally landing on me. Once they had locked onto my location, an awful wet tearing sound followed. And just a few inches under the eyes, a mouth had now formed, with long rotten teeth protruding from puffy gums. To my shock, the face embedded in this abominable creature was capable of speech. "No need for fear today. You will not die today. Not by me," it hissed in a deep, buzzy voice. "I require your assistance. In return, I will no longer hunt you or your family. This is a fair deal." All I could manage to stammer out was a weak, "What?" The creature took a couple steps forward, and the face extended out slightly to come closer to mine. Life in exchange for a service, easily understood, easily fulfilled. "Well, what do you want from me?" I continued to stammer while fighting back tears. "I just want to go back to bed, please." The corners of its non-existent lips slightly curled into what I think was supposed to be its version of a smile. The face slightly retracted into the hole before coming out again and speaking. "You must plant my seed. I will give you time to figure out how. But eventually you must find a way to bring my tale to the masses so that they know my name forever." I remember thinking it was like a virus whose host is thought itself. And with the number of hosts in our town dwindling, it was using me as a way of branching out. Doing what it wanted would put so many people in danger, but even so, with this satanic spawn bearing over me, the only thing I could say was, "Yes, it'll be done." Seemingly satisfied, the creature's face began to retract back inside the hole, but a part of me wouldn't let it go. I shouted for it to stop, and to my surprise, it did. "Why?" I blurted out. "Why do this? If you're intelligent, you must understand what kind of pain you cause us. Why not coexist?" My question seemed to baffle the creature. For a moment, the corners of its mouth drooped low, and its eyes excreted pus from the corners before returning to a neutral expression. "Why does the spider eat the fly? Why does the lion hunt the antelope? Why do the humans slaughter the pigs? The fish? Each other? It's in their nature." It flashed its pseudo-smile again. "Aren't our lives more important than nature?" I cried out. "When we kill, it's only to preserve ourselves. What you do to us is beyond that." It paused again and spit towards me before speaking. "How selfish to think self-preservation is only for you. I feed to sustain myself. You shift ecosystems and make entire species go extinct to sustain vanity. Surely you understand the pain you cause as well as I." The creature began to wrap its body around me. Dozens of sharp legs poked into my skin. "The difference is, this time you're the ones being hunted. You should be thankful I haven't yet decided to eat much more than my fill." I could feel the tingle of a stinger softly being pressed against my neck. I squeezed my eyes shut, preparing for a painful injection, but as soon as it had come, it was gone. I reluctantly opened my eyes, and luckily I was completely alone when I did. Not only that, but I had gained my freedom of movement back. Still, I didn't feel free, and I most certainly didn't feel safe. The only thing I felt comfortable doing at that moment was contemplating. For the first time in a long time, I knew I wouldn't be in danger because of my thoughts. But that fear for myself was replaced with a concern for others. Little did I know that that contemplation would take years. Not knowing what the ethical decision was, how long I had to make it, or why I had to be the one to make it has been hard. Some days I'd be so sure I was about to do the right thing, and others, I couldn't be more uncertain. It wasn't until I started writing more seriously that I finally found my answer. I don't consider myself a particularly good writer or storyteller, but at the very least, I think learning how to communicate an idea is a skill you can build on over time. As I've grown as a writer, so too has my ability to communicate a message. Thinking back to my high school days, there was rarely a time when I wasn't thinking up stories, either showing them to my friends and family or posting them anonymously online. Not only that, but I had always dreamed of getting out of the town I was in. branching out, so to speak. I think that's what the earwig saw. Someone who could communicate an idea to an audience outside of the idea's birth. And in the end, I did choose to communicate the story of the earwig. My safety and the safety of those I care about are far too important to risk by not doing it. And for those who will inevitably be impacted, I am so sorry. If there was any other way to do this, I would. But before I am judged for my actions, I at least want a chance to be understood. This decision hasn't come easy. But ultimately, I believe the earwig always knew what I would do. I think it chose people it knew would always choose to cling to life. In that way, its spread is inevitable. But the degree to which it spreads doesn't have to be. In making my choice, I figured if I could communicate its message, why can't I communicate mine as well? Who's to say that I don't warn you now? Who's to say that I don't tell you to do everything you can to ignore the earwig? So I am. Ignore the intrusive thoughts. Find distractions. Find other interests. Find reasons to convince yourselves it's nothing more than legend. Because if its existence is never a possibility, then neither are the consequences. And maybe together we can keep a tall tale just that, a tale. Story 2, Those Deep Dark Wells. The terrible thing happened at night, as most terrible things do. While I clicked away at my home job as a transcriptionist, I'd often watch the boys playing in the backyard. They'd be at it for hours, acting out some scene with foam swords and plastic guns, only stopping when the sun left to rise elsewhere. Seeing Mason happy made me happy. He'd finally found a friend. His father left us when he was 6 months old and more or less held no role in his life. Sure, there were the occasional visits every few years, but even those were short and feigned, not even so much as an annual birthday card. Perhaps that was why Mason anchored himself such a secure distance from other kids, a point driven home by his 5th grade teacher and several others. Part of me didn't blame him. Kids in school, especially the ones I can recall, weren't the friendliest bunch. If you were lucky, you could pick out the sharks from the minnows and avoid them. But honestly, they all looked the same, twined together in the same concrete box. Please give him a best friend, I'd whisper at my bedside every night, sending out the same message to God, or at least to something just as benevolent, to hear my prayer. Give my son his first best friend. Then one day, much to my wonderment, Mason brought Todd home for a play date. He was a petite boy with mismatched clothes, unkempt hair, and the bluest eyes you'd ever seen. I was ecstatic, relieved that my son had finally cracked open his shell and found a buddy. I saw him at the park, Mason told me when I asked how they met. He was sitting alone at the swings like he was sad. When he saw me on my bike, he waved and I waved back. Then we hung out and he was really cool. As he shared this, I couldn't help but smile at his excitement, so much deserved by the loneliest boy in the world. That night they had a sleepover and passed out in the living room. From my bedroom I could hear the muffled speech of our television, which they had left on. Sighing, I untucked myself out of bed and walked sluggishly down the stairs to them. Light from the screen pulsed and stretched over the sleeping boys. Mason was swaddled in his blanket on the floor, while Todd was curled up on the couch. I scanned for the remote, and after no luck, I moved to shut it off myself. Crick. A lone bag of chips crinkled under my foot. From the couch, Todd's shape twitched and then bolted upright. I meant to say, sorry, but I was stopped short. When Todd jutted awake and opened his eyes, I couldn't see them. They hadn't rolled up in their sockets or slipped to their sides. They were simply gone. 2 holes of singular darkness. Todd had blue eyes, vividly blue eyes. But at that instant, not even the glow of the television reflected off those dark membranes, black as Santa's coal. Then he blinked, and the eyes returned. Before I could say anything, his mouth stretched into a yawn, and his body slumped back into the cushions. I was stiff as a board, somewhat relieved I hadn't shrieked and woken them both up. My thoughts told me it was a trick of the light, as did any speck of reason. Vision played games with you that way. I switched off the television and went back to bed. A few weeks later, on an especially windy evening, a knock came at the door. Todd was there as usual, seesawing on his soles patiently. "Hi there," I smiled. "Hi," he smiled, his thin neck cocked. "Can Mason come out and play?" Before I even had to answer, Mason had already squeezed past me, still working one of his arms through his jacket sleeve. "Bye, Mom." I watched as they disappeared down the street. The rule was to be back before dark, and to their credit, the boys always returned just as the sky started to dim. On that particular outing, they came home with some cool rocks they'd found and dirt-clotted sneakers. By the time Todd was ready to walk back home, it had fallen too dark for him to go alone. I gave him a ride, with both boys in the back seat. It wasn't a far drive, as his house was only a few streets away. Every so often, my eyes would slip back to the rear view and see Todd watching the street, Mason dozing off next to him. As we passed beneath the street lamps, a bar of light would creep through the window, roll over his face, and vanish over his head. The car suddenly rocked as my wheels rolled too hastily over a speed hump. His gaze left the window and met mine. Only this time, as the slanted light skimmed over his features, blue eyes did not look back at me. They were gone, blotted out by the same oily darkness. Silent, murky circles. Even his skin, in just that quick moment, looked different, like dry mottled clay fit poorly over a skull. Lips bloodlessly shriveled. I slammed on the brake, jostling all of us with a sudden lurch. Mason gasped himself into wide-eyed awareness. As fast as it had happened before, the straight-faced horror in my back seat returned to a sweet young boy, shocked and surprised. "Sorry," I breathed. "Sorry about that, guys. I thought I saw a cat in the road." We reached Todd's house, a white ranch style with a flowering dogwood tree in the front yard. As the boys said their goodbyes, I could only stare into the dashboard, my heart sending tremors down my arms. The world felt off its tilt, as if the lines separating actuality and nonsense were blurred. I was disoriented by how real it seemed, his eyes like deep, dark wells, his unhealthy skin stretched and pulled like a death mask. My thoughts clashed with the fold of my brain that formed logic, and eventually, logic won. It was all in my head, period. But despite how far-fetched it sounded, I actively avoided eye contact with Todd, not even giving a sliver of opportunity for that oily pitch to return. If it even happened in passing glance or a quick double take, I'd be back to circling the rim of a mental collapse. A week later, I went to pick up Mason from Todd's house. I'd pulled up along the curb, texted, "I'm here," and waited there for some time. There was no sign he'd read my message, nor did he answer any of my calls. When I got tired of waiting, I twisted the keys out of the ignition and made my way up the slim walkway. The house was missing a great deal of shingles, which scarred its roofline in dark patches. The rain gutters were clogged and stunk of decomposing leaves. I knocked briskly and waited. The door unlocked, held only partially open by a door chain. "Yes?" the face peeking out asked. His voice was nasally, like it was lodged somewhere in his throat, right in the pit of it. "Hi, I'm Holly, Mason's mom, here to pick him up." The door closed and then opened fully as the chain slid out of its holder. The man on the other end was lanky, with onset baldness widening his forehead, his eyes tired and heavy. "Oh, sorry about that," he said, flashing a thin-lipped smile and offering a handshake. "David, the boys are probably still on their way back, but they'll be here any minute now. You can come inside and wait if you'd like. I've got some tea ready to go." I took him up on the offer and followed him inside. At our immediate right was the living area, where a woman sat watching a rom-com on the television. Paying no mind to the sound at the door, she kept her back to us. Beneath the show's timed laugh track, I could hear the sound of hard, labored breathing. Hanging over the side of the sofa drooped a thin, skeletal wrist. On the wall, a gray Kit Kat clock shifted its eyes and wagged its tail. The kitchen was small, with a triangular arrangement of sink, stove, and refrigerator, a small dance between the three. Flowery wallpaper looped around the room. A formica-topped table sat against the wall with minty green chairs. I took a seat in one as David retrieved some cups from the cabinet. The smell of light orchid drifted through the air. "Hope you like green tea," he said quietly as he filled the cups and brought them over. "Green is fine," I replied, taking the cup from him. "Thank you." He planted himself in a chair. "They're really fond of each other, aren't they? The boys, I mean?" "I'd say so. You can hardly keep Mason away," I laughed. By this point, I had noticed the dark pouches beneath his eyes more clearly. In fact, his overall appearance seemed to hang in a mournful sag. Whatever supplement he needed, he was missing a lot of it. "So how long have you been in the neighborhood?" I asked for the sake of conversation. "Oh, a good while now," he mused, rubbing a finger along his cup. "Really? I'm surprised Mason didn't meet Todd sooner. Our houses aren't too far from each other." "Todd?" he asked, as though needing a moment to remember his own son's name. "Oh yes, that is pretty surprising. He, gets around. Mason never sees him at school. Does he go to a different district?" Lines creased his mouth. "School, well, From the living room, a harsh, guttural coughing reached us. David's neck swiveled toward the sound. "Excuse me, my wife needs me." He left his chair and hastily went to her. Not too long after that, the front door opened as Todd and Mason arrived. As we said our goodbyes to David and his silent wife, he clasped my hand in a tight shake. "It was nice meeting you, Holly, really. It was." When he released his grip, I realized something was left in my palm. When we were back in the car, I folded it open. "What's that, Mom?" Mason asked. "Nothing, sweetie." I smiled back at him, placing the crumpled note in my lap. A phone number, a time to call, and the word "help" scribbled into its loose leaf. It was nightfall when I unfurled and read it again. I was in the backyard occupying a seat at our fire pit, my cell phone in one hand and a cigarette pinched in the other. The note said to call at 8, which was only 5 minutes away. As the time drew closer, my chest grew tighter with anxiousness. Moments ago, I'd snuck into my own room, pulled out the bottom shelf of my dresser, and unearthed the pack of Marlboros hidden there. 3 years I'd been without them, and 3 years I'd kept my promise to Mason to stop smelling like an ashtray. But tonight, shamefully, they were the only thing holding me together. When the clock on my phone pulsed 8, I took a long drag on the cigarette and dialed the number. The tone churred in and out a few times and finally connected. "Hello?" David's voice chattered on the other end. "Who is this right now?" My heart rattled in my throat. "It's Holly, Mason's mom." The voice exhaled and then returned briskly. "I need you to listen to me, okay? Are you listening?" "Yes, I'm listening." "Keep it away from your boy." The fire pit popped and spat a few embers. "Keep what away? What are you talking about?" "Listen," he snapped, a manic weight to his words. "Don't let Mason come over here anymore. It isn't safe for him. Don't even let it go over there. You have to stop this now." I twisted my neck back toward the house and then leaned forward in my chair. "Are we talking about your son right? No, isn't my son," he scorned. "Not at all. Not in any way. You need to calm down. If you need help, I can call the police." "No, no police," he screamed, his voice so tight and stressed that it splintered on the other end. "It will take more from her if you do that. My wife, she can't handle much more. It's taking something from her, taking something from me. We can't get rid of it now. It's too late for us, but not for you. You can stop this." He started to weep and mutter to himself, It came to our door to use the phone. Why did we let it in? Why did we let it use the fucking phone? Something stirred in his background. He paused and then whispered, "Keep it away from him." And then he hung up. I'm not sure how long I sat out there, but it was long enough for the flames to shrink into powdery mounds. When I entered the house again, Mason was on the couch with his tablet. "You smell weird," he said, taking note of me. "The fire pit," I lied, my thoughts too heavy to muster anything else. He flashed me a big smile and tactfully asked, "Can I have a sleepover at Todd's this weekend?" "No," I answered stiffly. "That isn't going to work." "Why not?" he persisted. "Todd always sleeps over here. Why can't we do his?" "Because, Mason," I said no. End of story. He shot an icy look of defiance at me. "Fine. Then he'll sleep over here then." "No, he won't. We are going to take a break from Todd for a while." His jaw opened, flabbergasted. "You can't do that." "I just did," I said, perhaps a little too matter-of-factly. As I walked back up the stairs, I could feel the burn of his eyes watching me on every step. Both of our nights now ruined. David's deranged garble on the phone sat with me for the rest of the night. I had no idea what to do, what to fix, what to think. "Keep it away, it isn't safe for him." The message, so vague but also desperately clear. I had to keep Mason safe. That was all that mattered. The next day after Mason was back from school, I sat him down on the couch. "I'm sorry for last night," I said. "I was very stressed, but that is not the way I want us to speak to each other again, okay?" His eyes naturally scanned the floor. "Okay. I love you, Mason, and no matter what, I want you to be safe. So there are a few things I need to know about Todd. Will you do that for me?" He nodded again, his sneakers softly kicking the backpack slumped on the carpet. "Did he ever act weird or strange to you?" His head shook. "What about his parents? Did he act different around them at all?" Same answer. I wasn't sure how to word the next question, but I did my best anyway. "Did he ever do something with his eyes?" This time Mason nodded. My heart squeezed itself smaller. I wanted so much to change the subject, to retreat to the kind cadence of sanity. But I had to know more. I had to protect my son. "What did he do with his eyes?" "A trick," Mason replied hesitantly. "Told me not to tell anyone, though." "You have to tell me." His lips crinkled, trying to keep the secret zipped up. Then he finally spoke. He could make them disappear. I felt drugged by his words, my head even feeling lighter, like all the logic in the world had just been raptured away. "You did see them," my thoughts repeated. "You did see the deep, dark wells." As quickly as all my self-doubt left, a scrim of dread filled the empty spaces. "Did it scare you?" I asked. "A little," Mason replied absently. "He said not to be, though, that he'd show me how to do it too." I grabbed his shoulder, making him jump suddenly. "He didn't though, right? He didn't do anything to you?" He looked confused, like I was the one talking crazy now. "No. I know that he is your friend, Mason, but I need you to promise that you won't see him anymore." Mason's gaze flicked back to mine, his eyes wide with betrayal. "What?" The tears began to come down. "Promise me," I repeated, the words like razors scraping down my tongue. "I don't want to." "Mason!" After much hesitation, he tearfully replied, "I promise." I hugged him, closed my eyes, and surrendered to the cruelty of it all. For the rest of that hellish week, I kept my ears tuned for the knock at the door. For whatever reason, Todd never used the doorbell. Inevitably, the knock came. Behind the frosted glass of our front door, I could see Todd's vague shape teetering on his soles. When the door opened, he smiled up at me. "Hi, can Mason come out and play?" "Sorry, dear," I smiled back. "Mason can't play today." The corner of his mouth lifted as his neck cocked to the side. Can he later? No, I don't think so, sorry. His nose wrinkled and the skin between his eyebrows creased. Okay. I closed the door, watched him leave, and that was that. It might take a few times, but eventually the message would sink in. Leave my son alone. I felt a sense of pride behind that, and what could possibly better protect a boy than his mother. But when I turned and saw Mason's cold eyes from the stairs, the pride all but evaporated. When Todd returned the next day, I gave him the same answer. Then the day after that, and the one after that. I couldn't even refuse to answer when he knocked. Otherwise, he'd sit there and wait, knock again, and wait some more, knowing full well we were home. 4 straight evenings of it, and poor Mason. He had every right to despise me for this. No parent could want to wall themselves between their son and his best friend, his first friend. But what choice did I have? We were drifting apart, orbiting ever farther away from one another. He was my prisoner, and I was the judge, sentencing him back to a lonely world. Surely he'd make new friends, right? The world was full of them, and if anything, this was proof that he could find them. That thought helped me cope anyway. When the knock came for the 5th time in a row, my tolerance had run out. Todd wasn't catching on, and to make matters more irritating, it was 8 or so at night this time. Part of me hoped it was someone else. Maybe a neighbor bringing a package by that was wrongfully left on their doorstep. But I knew better than that, and I was not allowing this to go any further. Mason was doing his homework at the kitchen table when I passed by him. No acknowledgement whatsoever. When I pulled the door open, Todd was standing beneath our porch light, both shoulders hunched over his ears as though expecting me to smack him. And perhaps verbally, that was what I did. Go home, I said assertively. We're done. No more of this, all right? Can Mason come out to play? He asked sorrowfully, as though it weren't after dark. No, Todd, he can't, and he won't the next day or the next. Now go home and stay there. His small arm rubbed his sleeve nervously. It's really dark. I don't want to walk home alone. Can I use your phone to call my parents? I felt absolutely cruel, but I also knew the game he was trying to play. You walked here on your own. You can walk back on your own. Then, as I moved to close the door and end the conversation, Todd made his eyes disappear. The darkness washed over them quickly and seemed actually to curdle in his sockets. A thickening, horrible texture. His face became milk wax, the sad child disappearing behind it. Beads of perhaps sweat dripped from his temples. One ran into his eye and vanished into the void. I want to come inside, he spoke, the sorrowful note in his voice also gone. My heart slackened to a deep, slow throb. I felt the need to pinch my side, to tweak it hard enough to draw blood and wake from this moment. Between the dead, shriveled lips, I could see the decayed tips of black teeth. Can I please come inside? He asked. No, I said semi-reactively. His black, craving eyes narrowed at me. For a moment, I actually thought they started to cry, but it was the darkness dribbling down his cheeks, oozing like oil slicks. I just want to play with Mason. The sound of it, the sound of that horrible face saying my son's name, snapped me out of the shock. I slammed the door closed and quickly locked it. Mason stood stiffly in the kitchen. His expression was only a shimmer of consciousness, vacant as a sleepwalker. Mason, look at me, honey. It's all okay. Everything's going to be okay. But his unfocused eyes were not facing me. 3 firm knocks came from the door. When I turned to face it, a dark shape lingered behind the frosted glass. A tall figure, taller than any adult, was hunching to look inside, and from behind the single pane that separated us, its vague shape didn't move. From the other side, Todd's childish voice was still calling, "Can I please come inside? Don't you want to play, Mason? Don't you want to play?" I could feel it watching us, like static vibrating the air. When I tried to move Mason, he refused to budge. staring emptily toward the evil thing behind the glass. Heavy as he was, I scooped him up in my arms and bolted for the stairs. It won't break in, my thoughts uttered. It isn't allowed to. That much I was sure of. If it wanted to get in, it would have by now. It needed to be invited. I shut both of us away in the bathroom upstairs, and when the sounds of the front door finally ceased, Mason snapped out of it. He was confused, like he'd just missed everything that transpired. I wasn't sure whether to consider that a blessing or not. Perhaps it was, and perhaps also, it was not God that answered my prayer. It was impossible to digest what happened that night. Sometimes I'd linger on the stairs, right on the top step, and watch the doorway, wondering if the glass would suddenly darken, if Todd's voice would slip through and ask to come inside. One night, David had left a voicemail on my phone. "She's gone," his voice whimpered. "It got what it wanted from her, drained her dry. Now my wife won't wake up, and it's left us. I don't know what it wants from your boy, but it wants something. No matter what, don't let it back inside." The message cut out after that, and he still won't answer my calls. Todd never did come back, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Strangely enough, the one least affected by all of this was Mason. I was worried to see him fall back into that distant bubble, but that isn't what happened. He'd started to make friends with other kids around the neighborhood, new friends, normal friends. He'd become a real social butterfly, and despite my brain ripping itself apart to understand what I had seen, I at least had that comfort to cling to. Seeing Mason happy made me happy. Lately, though, I've been feeling strange. It's been harder to feel motivated about things, let alone get out of bed in the morning. Even my appetite has started to dwindle. Day by day, I've been growing increasingly sapped and lethargic. I don't know what's wrong, but it's getting worse. Mason's been helping me get around the house, even going out of his way to play chef and make me things to eat. He's a good boy, but sometimes, dear Lord, I catch something in his eyes, something that shouldn't be there. But it's only a trick of the light, please God. Let it only be a trick of the light. Story 3. Stained Glass. Some urban legends have a way of weaving themselves into communities like a sparkling accent. When I was a substantially younger man, our favorite local tale was the Grapevine Angel story. A crumbling and weathered concrete angel stood vigil in Grapevine Cemetery over the grave of someone whose name had long worn away from the porous headstone. The old-timers in town said, if you kissed your true love in front of the stone figure under the light of a full moon, the wings would flutter. My generation wasn't satisfied with an endearing folk tale. Most aren't these days, so it seems. No, at some point it transformed into a grim tale of terror and revenge for anyone foolish enough to cross the angel's path after sundown. Gone were the sweet thoughts of finding your everlasting love, and an angel of vengeance came in its place. Teen angst was well in place with every generation, though I think they get a bit darker every decade or so. Two stone hands that had once reached toward the heavens had long ago broken away. Time and erosion took them, if you asked the cemetery caretaker. An angry drunk shot them off in a fit of rage, if you asked anyone from my graduating class. He was found down the road, they said, eyes missing and a stone hand shoved down his throat. Of course, both stories are absolute bullshit. How do I know? Evidence. I always trust the evidence. The first version of the tale is sweet, don't get me wrong. Who wouldn't love to think you could kiss your girl in the shadow of a grave marker and find out if they were the one meant for only you? I'll admit I tried. Rose Ellis and I stood in the moonlight below that angel the summer before our senior year. Those stone wings held firm as we kissed in the darkness. We got married anyway and had a lot of happy years together until a brain aneurysm took her away far too soon. Version 2 is equally false, and the evidence backs that up as well. No record exists of a man being found on Sandcut Road with no eyes and a stone hand in his esophagus. I guess some of you think there is that outside chance it could have happened. If you're a local, you almost certainly think I'm wrong. I get it, but the evidence is once again on my side. You see, I joined the Madison Police Department a few years out of high school. Night shift in a town of less than 20,000 wasn't exactly a thrill a minute. Sure, you'd have a couple of public intoxication arrests or the occasional break-in, but a lot of our nights were spent at the station listening to the scanner and taking a call here and there. During my first year on the job, I scanned old reports from 1960 to 1990, looking for a single file to corroborate the Grapevine Angel killing. Guess what? Not a damn thing to be found. Follow the evidence. It usually won't let you down. Urban legends, as I said, have a way of weaving into a community. The Grapevine Angel lasted generations, and the tales still thrive today, to my understanding. I chased my fair share of high schoolers out of that cemetery in the dead of night until I moved on to a position as a homicide detective. Beat cops would still laugh around the break room when someone mentioned catching a batch of kids out there. I'm not here to talk about the Angel, though. Sorry if you feel misled. My thoughts wander more often than not these days. Old age and cheap alcohol drag you in odd directions. Retirement has played hell on my mental health, and self-medication is all I have left. No, I want to tell you about Old Salem Church and its stained glass windows. Amber Bates, too. I'll try and make sense of it all, but there's a problem. Evidence. That word has defined so much of my life. I flounder without it, and there is so damn little here that it has driven me mad. Sometimes urban legends weave into a community like cancer. It penetrates places you cannot see and chokes the life out of everything it touches. Thick roots grow and spread before you can do anything to stop it. Sometimes these legends aren't legends at all. Everyone around the Madison PD knew about the disappearances in the unincorporated township of Crenshaw. It was a constant topic of conversation at the water cooler or during a third round at Duke's Saloon. With a population danging just under 1,000, Crenshaw wasn't much more than a dot on the map. But it drew law enforcement's attention in a way a place that's small never should. People vanish there frequently, at least 45 from 1966 to 2022, ages ranging from 14 to 19. Primarily teenagers from Madison and other surrounding communities. Most, if not all of them, were related to the dilapidated Old Salem Bible Church on Parkway No. 30 Road. It was little more than a skeleton with a dipping roof when I graduated too many years ago, and time hadn't been any more kind to it since. Old Salem Church was a party house for teenagers. A trust had been established to take care of it. But at some point, interest waned, and it fell into ruin. Gates and fencing had been installed decades before to keep trespassers out, but the same lack of care as the building brought them to ruin. As a young beat cop, I was relieved not to have it in our jurisdiction. Seeing as we were cops over in the big city of Madison, none of these disappearances hit our desks. The troopers at the state police and the country sheriff's office handled investigations in the rural areas. While Crenshaw was only 15 minutes outside of our city limits, they made it known our assistance wouldn't be necessary. Hell, even when someone from our sleepy little town vanished there, the troopers refused to share case information. What little bit we knew came from the poorly written local paper or the liquor-loosened lips of a trooper stopping at Duke's for a few rounds before heading home. I know I may make the state patrol sound like a cluster of assholes, but that's how it was back then. Territorial. Cases are to a detective what a bone is to a dog. It's yours and you don't give it up easily or without a fight. It turns out curiosity really does kill the cat. In the mid-90s, the city of Madison annexed unincorporated Crenshaw, causing a laughable population increase of 1,000 and increasing our territory a bit farther into the rural areas. While I didn't think much of it at first, that changed quickly when Jeannie, our file clerk, rolled a dolly of careworn cardboard boxes to my desk and dropped them with a thud. "What's all this?" I asked with a comical eyebrow arched in her direction. Running out of room in storage? Cases from the state police and sheriff's office, she replied with a tired smile. They've been coming in all day and I'm dropping them off as they arrive. Don't worry, Henry. Only one of them is yours. My eyes drifted to the box she slid onto the corner of my desk. There had only been one homicide in Crenshaw in the previous 3 decades, and it seemed unlikely there would have been more than 2 or 3 folders worth of material for that. A drunk farmer named Harold McCoy had shot a hired hand for trying to teach his daughter about the birds and bees. The case was so old that McCoy was paroled and in his grave by then. An entire box seemed a bit much just for that. Jeannie, I mumbled, this can't all be homicide cases. There are more pounds of paper here than people in Crenshaw. Just doing as I'm told, Detective Wellborn, she replied, tossing me a playful salute. Lots of missing person cases transferred over, and the chief said to split them up between detectives. Cold cases. Weekend work, he called it. I was to object further. But before I could, a young fella was yelling for Jeannie from the file room. Another load of files, I guess. No more showed up at my desk that day, and that was a small relief. My workload wasn't exactly overflowing, but I was due to testify in court 3 times over the following month, and had spent most of those days preparing my testimony. Pulling open the box, I briefly thumbed through some of the files. The papers inside were nearly as yellowed as the folders they sat in. A rolling must of mothballs and stale air seemed to waft out. It was like opening an unused barn in the heat of summer. Overwhelming. My stomach turned at the aged aroma. The clock on my desk told me it was nearly quitting time. While most people live for the end of the workday, it wasn't my highlight. The house was a lonely place. Just an empty box I sat in until I went to sleep. Nothing there but me and daydreams of what life should have been like. Rose had died less than a year before, and I should have been home when it happened. Maybe I could have helped. Probably not. But those intrusive thoughts like to stay for a drink when they creep in. I'd found her on the floor in the kitchen after working a double. Her eyes were open, and she just had this confused look on her face. Maybe she felt the aneurysm before it ruptured. Maybe she was trying to figure out what spice she was looking for in the open cabinet before fell. I just held her and cried for God knows how long. She felt cold, and I just wanted to warm her up. My thumb fidgeted with the label on one of the folders. There was nothing before me but an endless night of trash television, a microwave meal, and talking to a woman who could no longer answer me. I decided to take a look at one of the missing person cases before the chief asked. Tucking the box under my arm, I headed to the car. A glass of scotch in hand, I read the 30 or so pages of the first moldering case file. Trevor Bates was the 16-year-old son of Homer and Amelia Bates. His father worked as a brick mason, and his mother was a homemaker. The young man had gone missing in the summer of 1968. His friends reported that he had last been seen at a small gathering at Old Salem Church. During the evening, he vanished. Between 5 and 8 teenagers congregated at Old Salem Church to drink beer around a bonfire. It was noted in the file that while teenagers frequently held parties there due to the remoteness of the location, they were always held outside. The church building seemed unsafe even to youth who used the property. According to at least 3 of the witnesses, Trevor smoked marijuana for the first time that evening. No one described him as out of control, but he verbally stated he wanted to explore the inside of the church. The others attempted to talk him out of entering the dangerous building, but he insisted he need to go inside. An unidentified young woman told the investigators that Trevor confided in her that someone from school told him that if he went into the church under the light of the full moon, the stained glass windows in the chapel would show him 5 scenes from his past and 1 from your future. She showed him that all of the windows had been broken, but Trevor insisted that he needed to go inside. While the remainder of the group sat at a bonfire sipping beer, Trevor slipped away and entered the church. Fearful that the structure was unstable, the other teenagers called his name from outside but received no answer. Two of the young men retrieved flashlights from their vehicles and shined them into the broken windows, but saw no sign of their friend. Mr. and Mrs. Bates reported him missing the following morning to the county sheriff's office. A call had been made by an unidentified source that morning, providing the names of others in attendance. They were questioned and released to their parents, having provided no useful information as to Trevor's whereabouts. His pickup truck was discovered parked behind a tree line on the Old Salem Church property. A sweep of the building produced no additional evidence. At the bottom of the final page were scribbled 4 strange words. "Windows are all unbroken." It was an odd remark to add, as it contradicted the earlier statement when the young woman reported showing Trevor the broken windows. I picked at the thread with my mind, but moved on when I found no solid grasp. Still, it nagged at my mind like food caught between your teeth. No one ever saw or spoke with Trevor again. The case was unremarkable yet. It was the 60s, the age of free love, cheap dope, and aimless youth. It wasn't unheard of in those days for some bored farm kid to hop in an old Volkswagen van with a crew of perfect strangers and go to find enlightenment on the coast.
You will never sleep
A load of
again.
drunk, stoned teenagers saying he vanished in an old church was difficult to
Let
believe.
me out.
But the kid had still gone
Let
missing.
me out.
Him and over 20 more. No contact, no evidence, no bodies. Just vanished like smoke on the breeze. While I had intended only to read the first file, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table as the sun crawled over the horizon. I'd gone through all of the cases that night and into the next morning. Sometimes a kid vanished at a party. Other times, someone would disappear randomly. Days later, a friend would tell the missing child's parents or a trooper that they were headed to Old Salem Church to see their future. There was the occasional mention of increased patrol activity in the area. Troopers and deputies made regular checks of the place, but it was hard to keep it covered. Area funding was thin, and there was barely enough coverage for the rural areas in those days. Even on the occasion that a trooper happened upon a kegger at the old church, the kids would scatter to the wind before a cruiser could make it down the rutted gravel drive. After a disappearance, patrols would increase, but we've got short memories. After a tearful mother leaves the news cycle, patrols tend to be redirected to higher population areas. It's almost like we never learn a damn lesson. Every disappearance led back to those damn stained glass windows. I had chuckled the first 2 or 3 times. It reminded me of the grapevine angel of my youth. These kids flocked to the church for the same reason I had taken Rose to the cemetery for that long-ago kiss. A possible glimpse at the future. Silly as the urban legend was to me, I had read case after case of teenagers going missing from the same place over the course of decades. Grieving parents and siblings would occasionally call our department after we annexed the township. Some of the people had been missing for 2 decades, but you could hear the ripe grief in their voices. I read every damn one of those case files from cover to cover at least a dozen times in the small hours of the night, making notes on similarities, spitballing a profile for a serial killer I doubted even existed. The frustration of the drunken troopers at Duke's made sense. There was just no damned evidence in those files. I had intended to go to work the following day, but I knew I'd never be able to concentrate on my work. With my best impersonation of a flu-tinged voice, I called dispatch to inform them I wouldn't be coming in. Instead, I slid behind the wheel of my truck and drove toward Crenshaw. Parkway No. 3 Road was only a road by virtue of its name. In reality, it was no more than a rutted gravel drag, scabbed with high patches of grass. My old pickup rumbled roughly in the dips and over the sudden rises. The weathered steeple of Old Salem Church bobbed over the tree line ahead of me like a crooked vulture neck waiting for its next meal to die. A chill ran down my spine as creeping fear surged through my body. I knew I should have turned the truck around, but my foot deadened on the gas and continued to push me forward. As I pulled around the line of trees blocking it from my view, the full church came into vision. Perched on a squat hill, the grayed wooden building looked as though it may collapse at any moment. Bright shards of colored glass bordered the window frame, looking like a rainbow of incisors. It had looked that way for decades. Once a place of worship, it became no more than a flophouse for drunk kids. Sitting just at the bottom of the hill on the hood of a battered blue Ford Taurus sat a young woman. I put the truck into park a few yards from the unexpected visitor. I jumped out and walked toward her. "How you doing today, ma'am?" I asked in the friendliest voice I could muster. Finding someone there in the middle of the day hadn't occurred to me, and her presence made me feel uneasy. She had long brown hair that framed a mischievously pretty face. Smoke drifted around her in the lazy afternoon breeze. She looked a bit like Rose, and it made my heart ache. "You the cop?" she asked, and I froze. "Pardon me?" She slid down from the hood of her car and walked in my direction. We made eye contact, and the intensity of her gaze nearly made me look away. It felt like she was looking into my soul, almost as if she knew something about me that I didn't know about myself. "I asked if you are the cop," she replied in a soft but serious tone. "I didn't think you'd show." "Why would you expect to meet me here?" I asked. "I don't know you." "I don't know you either," she said with a smirk. "But here we are. I'm Detective Henry Wellborn with Madison PD, I said, slipping my badge from my back pocket. She looked at it with the intensity of a trained killer. "What's your name?" "Italy Sky," she responded hesitantly. "That sounds unlikely," I said. The young woman shrugged and looked toward the ground. "Mind showing me some identification?" "I don't have to show you my ID," she spat. "Haven't done anything illegal." "No one said you did," I responded. "Just like to know who I'm talking to." She fumbled a hand into her back pocket and extended a laminated card in my direction. I took it gingerly from her hand and looked it over. Amber Bates filled the name line on the card next to a picture of her with the same captivating smirk. "Look," she said. "I didn't lie. My parents named me Italy when I was born, but changed it a few months later. But I like it. It's unique, and it keeps people from asking me about my uncle." "Who is your—" I began, but the words died off before I could finish the sentence. Her uncle was Trevor Bates. For hours, Amber and I sat on the tailgate of my truck, smoking her cigarettes and doing our best not to look at the skeletal church just ahead of us. When I asked why she was there, she just kept repeating that she was supposed to meet me. I asked her to elaborate, but she said it wouldn't make sense. I did my best to let it go, but the vagueness festered in my mind. She was the daughter of Trevor Bates' youngest brother. Since the youngest age she could remember, her family would only talk about him in hushed tones. Whenever she saw photos of him and asked her parents to tell them more about him, they changed the subject. A missing family member was always a delicate subject, but Trevor Bates had been the first of many disappearances from that damned place, and the family wore it around their necks like an albatross. Stories of her lost uncle followed her all through her school years as well. Children teased her, and teachers seemed to interact with her as little as necessary. The girl grew up like an outcast based on small-town superstition. I nodded and smoked as she told me about those troublesome years. "I met a nice boy in high school, though," she said with a smile. "Michael Baxter. We were only 17, but I thought we may get married, you know?" His name struck my brain like a bolt of lightning. Michael Baxter had gone missing 7 years ago at Old Salem. A few high school seniors camped out probably 50 feet from where we sat on the tailgate of my truck. When the boys woke up the next morning, Michael was gone, and the doors to the old church were pushed inward. "No foul play suspected," his file had said. "I met my wife when I was 17, I said through a lump in my throat. "The sting never really goes away when you lose someone." Amber looked at me in confusion.
Hey,
I could tell she wondered how I knew about Michael, so I tapped my badge sitting between us to silently indicate where I had gotten the information.
Where are you?
She smiled at me sadly and nodded before lighting up another cigarette. "I need to get going," she said, as her shoes made contact with the hard-packed dirt.
I'll never forgive you.
"It was nice to meet you."
Don't you run
"Amber,
away.
Italy," I called out as she walked back to her car. "How did you know you'd meet me here?" She sat in her car and fired the engine. "I went inside after Michael vanished," she said, pointing toward the church through her open car door. "Saw it in the stained glass." "What did you see?" I croaked. My pulse skyrocketed, and I could feel hot blood and the pounding of my heart in my ears. "Don't go inside, Henry," she called back. "I think that's what the last window wanted me to tell you." "What did you see?" I screamed at her, but it was too late. Amber shut the door of her car and hammered the ignition down the rough path. I watched as the pillars of dust floated into the air and her taillights broke the fallen darkness of the evening. I would find out later that, like so many others, no one ever spoke with Amber again. Her blue Ford Taurus was discovered 20 miles out of town on the side of the Pennyrile Parkway. I never saw the report, but I always wondered what it said. Probably no foul play suspected. Amber had left the rest of her pack of cigarettes on the tailgate, and I sat in the dark, smoking them all and gazing at the edifice of Old Salem Church. Headlights shot through the dilapidated structure from the parkway nearby, giving it the illusion that dark things moved between the wooden boards of the wall. I knew I should get in my car and go home, but I wanted to go inside and see the place for myself. I wanted evidence. Pulling open the rusting toolbox in the bed of my truck, I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar. I slipped on the light and aimed it at the church, bile roiling in my guts. As I began to walk toward the door, I felt like a child scared of the darkness. There was no sensible reason to be filled with so much dread. I pushed against the door expecting some resistance from the warped frame, but to my surprise, it pushed open gently. Rows of splintering pews filled the sanctuary inside, washed in the moonlight that filtered in through the patchwork of holes in the roof. An old coat rack draped in tattered cloth leaned haphazardly against the pulpit, looking like an otherworldly minister. Framing both sides of the sanctuary were ornate stained glass windows that seemed almost to glow through the darkness inside. The flashlight and crowbar tumbled from my hand as I shuffled forward in a trance. They were captivating. On the left, nearest to the door, was a scene of a young boy and a dog playing in front of the stream. It was Gilligan, my first pet. We played together every day after school until he was hit by a car. Next to it was an image of me during a high school baseball game. The number 3 was emblazoned on the back of my jersey, and a bat dangled from my right hand as I watched the ball soar through the air. It was the only home run I ever hit, and the coach screamed at me to run for home. A third was of Rose and me beneath a concrete angel kissing in the moonlight. Tears filled my eyes at the glass image of my wife, so young and beautiful in my arms. Happiness and sorrow swirled through my veins. Casting my eyes to the other wall, the window farthest away showed me a vision of myself at the police academy graduation ceremony. I was young, thin, and so proud that day. Still so unaware of how that job would keep me away from the woman I loved. In the center, 2 people sat on the tailgate of an old pickup smoking cigarettes. It was the perfect image of that very afternoon as I sat talking to Amber. The white glass of her smile glinted in my eyes. I hadn't noticed her smile as we talked, but she must have. Some happy memory in her ocean of sadness had won over her for just a moment. My eyes drifted to the floor for a moment as the buzz of tinnitus filled my ears. The next window would be the one to show me the future. I had hoped that, much like Amber, I would be allowed to leave that wretched place, unlike so many others. Truly, though, I feared the window would show me what had taken so many others before. With a sigh of horror and resignation, I looked toward the 6th window. There was an old man, a mop of white hair swept to the side, sitting on one of the church pews. Bright reds, yellows, and oranges came together to create a wall of flames behind him.
You're not
Dark
afraid of
figures
the dark,
stood in the blaze,
are you?
looking down at the forlorn
Don't be
man,
afraid.
looking down at
Come
me.
with me.
I turned and ran for the
I will
door
show
and
you
burst
where
into
I
the
play
cool
hide and
evening
seek.
air and soothing
Do you
moonlight.
want to play hide and seek?
My heart thundered as my
You
feet
hide,
hammered against
and
the
I'll
ground
find
toward
you.
my truck.
You're going
Fumbling
to
the
die
keys
in
from my
there.
pocket, I jumped in the
Don't
seat
say
and
I
readied
didn't warn
myself to
you.
get as far away from that dark place as I could.
I know things.
Then I
no
realized
one
my
knows.
hair had been white on the last window.
You're going to die.
It had shown me well into old age.
Help me.
Salt and pepper
I'm
danced
ready.
across my once dark
Can you
mane,
help
but
me?
it was far from white. The last window didn't represent
I'm
that
a
day,
little bit scared.
but I felt in the
lost
pit of my
way.
soul that the horrible
help me?
image would someday come
I'm
to
coming
pass.
for you.
In a stupor,
I'm going
I
to
got
be
out of the
there,
truck and headed back to the
watching
bed.
you.
A dented
I
red
will
gas
answer
can
you.
sat near the toolbox,
I
and I
will
pulled it
find
over
you.
the edge. I wanted the madness to stop then and there. If Old Salem Church burnt that night, there would be no white-haired version of myself to burn there in the future. No more missing kids either. I'd gladly pay whatever price came my way. The gas soaked quickly into the dry wood of the church walls. I emptied the entire canister and tossed it inside. The loud clang when the metal hit the sagging wooden floors made me wince. Without another thought, I pulled Amber's abandoned lighter from my pocket and struck the flint next to the wood. Flames erupted quickly and I walked back to the truck and drove away. Reds, oranges, and yellows licked at the night sky in my rearview mirror. I laughed and then burst into tears. It's over, I told myself. No more disappearances, no future in the flames. I wish I'd been right. I spent the rest of the night drinking scotch by the police scanner in my garage. Chatter was minimal during that night. My anxiety increased with every passing minute as I waited to hear someone report the fire on Parkway the Murder 3 Road. It had been nearly midnight when I got home, and by 3 a.m. there still hadn't been a peep. Part of me was relieved thinking that somehow no one from the Parkway had seen the flames. Maybe it burnt so quickly that no one even saw it to call in. Even if it was reported, the blaze would have gone on so long there would be nothing of the structure to salvage. Another part worried that the flames had gone out. I knew it was impossible, but still, I worried. Sleep came hard in the early hours. As soon as I woke up, I turned the scanner volume up, but there was still no word of a fire in Crenshaw. My stomach sat heavy, and a new sense of dread washed over my body. I got in the truck and drove as quickly as I could to Parkway the Murder 3 Road and down the twisting drag. There were no fire trucks or emergency vehicles, no smoke, only the line of trees blocking the view where the church would have stood. Above the trees, like a craning vulture, I saw the steeple of Old Salem Church, unburned and waiting for new carrion. Whoever finds these pages, I just want you to understand what has happened to me. I burned down Old Salem Church for the first time in 1995. It was standing in the same spot the next day as though nothing had happened at all. I felt insane, but I came to accept that the hateful place holds some terrible grip there. Something there hungers for the lives it snatches away. I burnt it again 5 more times over the years, but no matter how much gas I pour, or even if I stand there to watch that hellish frame crumble in on itself during the blaze, it'll be standing again the next day. It seems indomitable, a bastion of despair and hopelessness. My hair has long since gone white and I'm tired. Children still vanish in the area, and each time it happens I slip a bit further into madness. No one listens to me when I beg them to demolish the place. County costs are too high, they say. Putting up a gated fence or sealing off the road is out of the budget. Perhaps Old Salem gave me the answer, though. Maybe it just wants me. I've watched the place burn 5 times standing on the gravel drive and once in the rearview mirror of my old truck. It never works. I've been going about it all wrong. The 6th window showed me sitting inside, wreathed in flames. So I'll give that vile building what it wants. There are 6 cans of gas in the truck, and I plan to douse the whole place. I'll sit inside and wait for those dark figures to watch me burn. Maybe that'll be the end of all this. If I'm gone tomorrow and Old Salem Church is still standing, God help you all. I did what I could.